Chairman John Kim was born in Korea and studied in the United States. He received his bachelor's degree from University of Michigan and his MBA from University of Connecticut. He is the most successful Korean-American finance specialist in Wall Street, who had 25 years of experience as an accomplished business executive before he joined New York Life Investments in 2008. Since his inception as chairman, and New York Life Investments assets increased by 170%, which is evidence of his exceptional leadership. Even today, he created another new business in Korea with the Samsung. The $500 million US dollars will be the seed money for fund will be run by him from today. You will see the news in the media tomorrow morning. In addition to being a world-renowned finance specialist, John is a good friend of mine and wonderful advisor to Korea University Business School. And he will become soon the adjunct professor of Korea University Business School. Please welcome him to the stage with a round of applause.
Korea University Business School presents this to John Kim, Chairman and CEO, New York Life Investments, in commemoration of your contribution at KUBS, which have extended our insight and view toward the global financial market. Do-hee Lee, Dean, Korea University Business School, September 4th, 2013.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here. It is especially a pleasure because, as Dean Lee described, this was a very important day in the corporate life of New York Life to be announcing a strategic alliance with a company I think everyone in this room knows, Samsung. Samsung is a leader in many areas, and as you may know, in the financial services arena, Samsung Life Insurance and Samsung Asset Management, they are leaders. Both entities are leaders in the Korean marketplace. How many people have a Samsung phone? By show of hands. Well, there you go. And they are a leader in consumer electronics also. So it was actually a privilege and an honor to actually be associating the New York Life Company with such an important, not just Korean company, but a world company. And so this was an especially gratifying day for me personally and professionally. So I've been asked by Dean Lee to speak about the investment markets. I assume that a number of you are interested in investing. So I'm going to start my talk by giving you a quick overview of a presentation that I actually give to sophisticated institutional investors, retail investors, financial advisors, and the like. So that's part one. The second part, though, I've been asked actually to talk about sort of my career a bit and give you some insights from a career perspective that you could learn from, and that is something that is a little bit more difficult because we should spend a lot more time talking about that, and perhaps if Dean Lee would allow me, I can come back either later this year or sometime next year to even have a special session on this. So I'm going to give you an abbreviated version of some advice here that I would give you as you finish your schooling at Korea University and go into your work life. Okay? So is that a good idea? Very good. Oh, I also appreciate the fact that you're allowing me to do this in English as opposed to Korean here, because I speak first grade proficiency of Busan Saturi for anybody from Busan. Okay. So I've got a lot of slides, and what I'm going to do for you, actually, is I'm going to go over these slides quickly, And I'm sorry if you don't catch every aspect of the slide, but I want to give you an impression, of information that you would normally hear from somebody like me about the investment markets here. And so you don't have to fully understand every slide, but I'll give you, after my brief presentation, I think it'll give you a good sense of financial markets and what you might want to focus in on actually in your academic studies here. So the last 4 years, and I look around the room and you're all very young, certainly by my standards here, and so you may not appreciate what we've gone through the last 4 years, but these two line charts basically illustrate the fact that we've had one of the most remarkable performance in the last 4 years, both in the bond market and the equity market, from one of the worst financial crises that we experienced globally in 2008. And so this is yet an illustration. So if you were dumb money, I call it, dumb investor, and you just invested in the S&P 500 or the high yield bond index in the US, you would have more than doubled your money just by being in either of those two markets. So the environment has been quite remarkable, especially in the United States. You probably also know that the interest rate in the US has been until recently, at record low levels. In fact, many people over the last 2 years thought that the US may follow what's called the Japan scenario, because the Japanese economy and the markets have been basically in a 20-year doldrum and with record low interest rates in their markets. And so many people were concerned that the US is going to follow that. With the recent rise in economic activity in the US, as I'll illustrate in a minute, and also the interest rates having risen, I think that the concern, the fear that we're going to follow, US is going to follow the Japan scenario, is probably misplaced and not as big of a concern today. Even in the first half of 2013, off of a historic move in the fixed income and the equity markets, equities continue to do very well. In fact, this is through the first half. I would say that right now it's still up about 15% actually in the stock market. What is the reason for that? Unlike many countries around the world, the US economy is actually improving, with unemployment, which is a very important driver of determining whether the economy is vibrant or not, having declined from 10% 3 years ago to 7.4% today. We have some concerns, and you may know the term tapering by the Federal Reserve. Have any of you heard the term tapering? There's some concern that we're going to now begin to reduce the Federal Reserve balance sheet and sell some of, or not buy as many of the bonds that we have been from the Federal Reserve perspective. And that's one of the reasons why the world sort of stock market and bond markets have been concerned of recently, in addition to fears about the conflict in Syria and other macro factors. But the primary concern is what the Federal Reserve in the US is going to do. One of the big statistics that I follow, because it is, in the United States, it is 2/3 of the economy, is what the household, consumers in the US does in terms of its economic activity. And as you can see, that the net worth of households in America had declined fairly dramatically after the 2008 crisis, but as you can now also see, that it's actually recovered fully and is actually gone above the highs of 2007. So the US economy and many people in the United States are doing quite well today, despite what you may hear from Korea. Now that's my sort of short-term outlook. I want to give you a sense of what I like to talk about more so than others in the financial markets and certainly on Wall Street. And I want to correct one thing Dean Lee had to say. Dean, I think you said I was the most successful Korean American on Wall Street. I have to admit, that's Dean Lee's opinion. I appreciate that opinion, but there are others who would disagree with that, okay? There are a lot of people on Wall Street who are Korean Americans who are very successful also. So with that as a caveat here, I actually like to talk about the long term because I would suggest to all of you as students that short-term performance is important, but long-term performance is the real true test of whether you're good as an investor or as even a business leader. So 4 long-term themes that are very important in the U.S. that will have an impact on the Korean economy and on the long-term world economy also. So this is something that you are far too young to remember, but we had a bubble in the stock market in the 90s that was absolutely unprecedented, driven by the internet boom, the first internet boom, and you can see that the market crashed. In the decade of the 2000s, we had a similar type of a boom and bust in the housing market. In fact, the overextension or the leverage in the U.S. housing market was deemed to be the cause of the financial crisis globally in 2008, and you can see exactly when housing prices peaked and then the decline. What is really important today is not what happened back in history. History is a good lesson. Mark Twain has a wonderful quote. He says that history does not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. So you should write that quote down. It's a great quote. I use that all the time. History does not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. So what I would suggest to you is that stock market bubble and bust, the housing market bubble and bust, perhaps will not repeat themselves here. But from where we are with interest rates and the bond bubble, there is a rhyme to this, and this slide illustrates that point, is a fact that because we were at record low interest rates, it is inevitable from my perspective that the bond market bubble is going to burst. And as the slide indicates here, we've had a peak in the bond market. It's starting to come down, but I'm fearful that it could come down a lot more with the Fed tapering, with the economic growth activities. The question is we don't want bond interest rates to rise too much here, because if it does, then it will have some collateral effects on the U.S. economy and the global economy. So that's theme number 1. Second theme, and something even in the press conference today with Samsung I introduced in my prepared remarks, is that the United States is facing what is one of the most extraordinary events here in its history, and we call this the shale production growth. Are you all, any of you familiar with shale production technology? It's basically you're taking advanced drilling devices here with a lot of technological devices, and breaking rock formations to extract gas and oil that's embedded in basically bedrock formations. And with the advances in technology and the drilling technology, what's been determined is that the U.S., within the bounds of the continental U.S., there's enough shale-oriented fossil fuel to actually create energy independence for the United States. So as this slide illustrates, for the longest time, the U.S. has been very dependent on imports, oil imports here, to meet its demand. And it has shrunk from 30% deficit to about 19% today. And if you extrapolate out the production of shale gas and shale oil, it is estimated that within the next 20 years or so, that U.S. could actually be energy independent. Now, there are 2 important factors related to this here. One is that should make one very bullish on the U.S. economy and the U.S. financial markets. Second, though, to the extent that the world actually produces more energy, it makes energy prices lower, right? And for all of you who live in Korea, you're a net importer of oil, just as the U.S. is today. So to the extent that you have lower energy prices, that actually is better for the Korean economy also. So this is a phenomenon that is not a 2-year phenomenon, but it's going to be basically in your business careers when you realize this. So you should study more on the shale technology. Third is something that you all don't have an appreciation because you're too young. See, when I was your age, we actually had radios. We actually had telephones here, not cell phones, but telephones. And we had very big TVs. And this shows basically that it took a very long time for technology, 2-3 generations ago, to be adopted by consumers, 75 years to reach 50 million users for the telephone, 38 years for the radio. Does anybody have a radio here? Nobody has a radio, right? Some of you may not even know what a radio is. Television? You know television, of course. 13 years. The internet took 4 years, 3 years for the iPod, and Angry Bird. Everybody knows Angry Bird in this room. It took 35 days for the latest version of Angry Bird to be adopted within 250 million users here. The point here is I have witnessed professionally in my 30 years in business some of the most dramatic increases in technology. And I believe, because I've been told by experts in technology, that the next 5 years we are going to witness the most dramatic change in technology, more so than ever in the history of mankind. This is what you're living through. So when you finish your business degree at Korea University, which I've been told by Dean Lee is the finest business school in Korea. Is that right? That's it? I've actually been told that by many people outside of Korea University also, that when you go into business, you're actually going to be in the middle of one of the fastest change from the tech revolution that we've ever seen. That's something that's one part exciting, but it's also going to create a lot of volatility. Last theme that I would explain to you is emerging economies right now. Right now, everybody's concerned about the emerging economies because China has slowed down. India is going into a downward spiral. Brazil has suffered from the decline in commodity prices. Russia has also suffered from lower oil prices and commodity prices. And Russia has basic infrastructure problems. The rule of law is non-existent and the like here. So the BRIC economies are not doing well. So then the question is that going to persist for the long term? I do not at all. In fact, I was interviewed by a number of press people even after our news conference, and I said very categorically that while near term the emerging markets might suffer, long term it is absolutely undeniable that the emerging markets will continue to be actually the growth engine for the world. And you can see this, by way of example, is that the people in the emerging markets are younger population, and they will be more productive here because this dependency ratio will continue to be favorable versus developed marketplace. Now, one of the benefits that you have being in Korea is you actually are much closer to the Asian emerging markets. So as future business leaders, you should think about how you might want to take advantage of your geographic proximity here to some of the Asian economies, emerging markets here, to take advantage of that for your own sort of commercial success or career success too, okay? And you could see that on a purchasing power parity basis, the emerging markets have actually eclipsed the developed markets and will continue to. That GDP delta change is going to even be wider going forward. Let me also comment lastly on U.S. equities. I also got a lot of questions from the press that you may read in the next 24 hours about how is the U.S. equity market. And do I like the U.S. equity market? And based on this slide here, I won't get into the technicalities of this, but that I firmly believe that the U.S. equity market is in a strong position. While it's not undervalued by a wide margin, it's probably adequately valued, especially in the context of still low interest rates. So myself and other investors, senior investors in the New York Life Investment Organization remain bullish on U.S. equities. Now, you could always, I have some clips here, pictures from Time Magazine and The Economist, and I talk about tail risks, okay? While we can be constructive on financial markets, we always have to be mindful of some volatilities, volatile situations all around the world, starting with our friends here up north, little Kim. And in Korea, I'm not in Korea, but in the United States, the joke I always tell people is that I have no relationship to that Kim here. So John Kim is not related to the dictator Kim in North Korea. But there are clearly a lot of risks out there. But I would say on balance here that I'm quite constructive on the global economy and the global financial markets, but just to be aware of these tail risks here. So the concluding thoughts here before I get into the next segment and then importantly take your questions is that the economy and the markets continue to perform very well, that you as future leaders, you should really think about those 4 long-term themes that I mentioned to you. But also, if you want to be in investments, you always have to be mindful of what may happen, what may go wrong. And so you should think about those tail risks. Okay? All right. Now let me turn your attention to the other segment here that we'll call some advice that I could give you. And again, Dean, if you would allow me, I will come back either later this year or next year to have a special session on this. And as I was, because this was a last-minute request here, I actually had to email my staff in United States, and the person actually sent me the email a little before midnight, their time, earlier this morning, to send me this. These are 10 values that I have adhered to in my professional career. In fact, Dean, next time you visit me in New York in my office, I actually have a plaque that actually has these 10 values that I have on my wall. So this is not something that I have made up. This is something that I have used, not always here, but I always remember these. And I believe that if you adhere to these values as consistently as possible, and with your great education at Korea University, with your high intellect, that you will have as good of a chance of succeeding in the business world, whether it's in Korea or Singapore, Australia, or United States. These are values that can be applied globally, not just in the United States, because it's not about a country. It's actually not even about a profession. It's about who you are as a person, as a business person. So let me go through each of these with some summary comments here. Intense focusing on customers, your clients. There is a friend of mine long time ago said to me that you can start a business, but nothing happens until a sale is made, that you have to have customers. And so even if you're in finance or senior management or operations, knowing who your client is and focusing in on the needs of your client is extremely important. So you must start with that sort of a client orientation. Second, optimism is something that is, in my mind, a necessity if you're going to be successful in business here. Pessimists don't look at the upside. They always look at the downside. You have to be optimistic both personally and professionally if you want to grow a business or grow in your profession. So that's an attitude that you can carry forward, even in your schooling, and certainly as you go into your career. Being optimistic is extremely important. Third, thoughtful risk-taking. If you don't want to take risk, go work for the government or take on a government job or be a waiter or a waitress at a restaurant, because you're going to do the same thing over and over again, and there will not be much upside or downside. Business is about risk-taking, but it cannot be unfettered risk-taking. You have to take thoughtful risk. So know when to take risk, know when not to take risk. That risk-taking orientation is extremely important. Fourth, play to win. Very few people get rewarded for coming in second. This is not like the Olympics where you get a silver medal. Okay? In business, almost all the time, it's winner takes all, right? If you win, you get it all. If you lose, it doesn't matter whether you came in second, third, or fourth. I want to use a visual. If I had more time, I would actually post the visual here. But it is said, you're all familiar with horse racing? In America, horse racing is very popular, right? The visual that I'll leave you with is in a horse race, okay? If you're not the lead horse and you're in second, third, or fourth, the view from second, third, or fourth is you're looking at the rear end of the lead horse, right? The view is the same. So that's why it's so important here. I'm actually not getting this point across here because there would be some laughter associated with that here. But the view is that, the thought is here is that you have to be a leader here to really succeed in business. And being a winner is very, very important. That's why you have to play to win. Next is a sense of urgency. You heard of the old adage, time is money, right? You all are very smart people. I know that because in order for you to be in the program, you have to be very smart. Time is money. And if everybody had as much time needed to assess a situation, then most people can get to the right answer. It's really how quickly you can get to the right answer that's most important. That's why the sense of urgency is very important. I actually think as a trait, Koreans do very well here because most Koreans by tendency have a very urgent tendency. And so I think that as I look, most of you are Koreans here, that you'll do fine with this tendency here. The next item is the buck stops with you. That is, unlike being a government bureaucrat where they take no responsibility, in industry and business, you are the person who should be responsible. And so if you want to succeed in business, you have to assume responsibility. And that's what we mean here by when we say the buck stops with you. Next item, enjoy your work. We work basically very hard. In fact, I looked at some statistics here a few years ago, and you know, US workers and Korean workers are some of the hardest workers in the world. In fact, I think that in the US and Korea, we only take about 2 weeks vacation, where in Europe, like Germany and Italy, France, they take 12 weeks vacation. Can you imagine if you were working, taking 12 weeks vacation? So we're very hard workers here. Because you work so hard in Korea, in the United States, what's really important is, despite the hard work, it's important that you enjoy your work. There's a connection between enjoying your work and being optimistic. If you're happy in your work, you're generally more optimistic. So think about those two here, and you should really focus on enjoying your work. And I've gotten a lot of questions from people your age, well, what if I'm not enjoying your work? Then I would say, change it. You need to either move on to something else that you enjoy, but seek out something that is a passion of yours here. I tell people that for the vast majority of my career, I wake up in the morning really happy because I enjoy my work so much. And it's not because I make money or I'm in a high position. I just enjoy being in the investment business. So all of you should seek out jobs that you wake up in the morning and say, I really like doing what I'm doing. Eighth is you have to strike a work-life balance here. And this is not something that is easy. In fact, I struggle with that often, especially during my 30s and 40s. But this is something that's very important because in the long term, if you don't strike the right balance here, then you become too extreme. If you focus too much on the home life and away from work, you're deemed to be lazy by your bosses in business and corporation. If you work too much here and forget about your family or your personal life, your health might suffer and your family life might suffer. So striking that balance is extremely important. Ninth item is, unless you're going to be an entrepreneur and work for yourself, I imagine that most of you would want to work for the Samsungs of the world, the Hyundais, the Kyobos, and the like, that these are large corporations that will value you not only for your individual contribution, but actually importantly for how you interact with a team. And so teamwork is extremely important. In fact, one of the criteria that I use when I look for senior leaders, people who I can promote, are those who can interact with the team better than others here. So committing to teamwork is very, very important. And then last but not least, integrity and professionalism. And I actually put this last because I think it's the most important. Whatever you do, whether it's manufacturing or service, if you do not display the level of professionalism and integrity, you will not get ahead in professional business career. Ben Franklin said of integrity and reputation, it is like a fine piece of glass that it takes such a long time to create that fine piece of glass, but if you drop it, it shatters in 1 second, okay? And so you don't get a second chance with that. If you were at New York Life, if you were at Samsung, and you developed a great reputation for being a very professional person and somebody with high integrity, but then you make one mistake, you don't get a second chance. So that's something that you always have to honor and be very thoughtful of here in anything you do. And so what I would suggest to you is that you don't have to take on every one of these values, but I hope that each and every one of you will take 2 or 3 of these, and even while you're in Korea University's business school, even practice this, because it will serve you, actually, I think, just as importantly as the classwork learnings that you're receiving, the great teachings and the coursework that you're receiving from this great institution. One is about the head. This is about how you act and how you are as a person, okay? With that, I'm going to get a drink of water, and I'm going to ask for some questions. You could ask me questions about my career, about the investment markets, anything that you wish.
I have 2 questions. I want to ask Wall Street Bank's future. Some people said investment banks will never recover after financial crisis. Do you agree with that view? Or they will get up again? Second question is about China and United States relations. China is planning to set up Shanghai Financial Center and seeking yuan internationalization. Is it going to threaten Wall Street power? What do you think the power shift from United States to China? That's all.
So in response to your first question, whether Wall Street investment banks will recover, my answer is no. it will not recover to the former state that it enjoyed prior to the financial crisis for two reasons. One is that in the U.S., they've actually made new laws that prohibit many of the activities of investment banks that they engaged in prior to the financial markets collapse. The broad law change was a law called Dodd-Frank, and so that has permanently changed the ability of Wall Street to be the same prior to the financial crisis. In many respects, the provisions of Dodd-Frank and the Volcker Rule, which is a subset of Dodd-Frank, has created now a determination where it's going back to an environment where the commercial banks and the investment banks used to be segregated under a law that was created in the 30s after the Great Depression in the U.S. Called Glass-Steagall. So that would be my answer to part one of your question. The second part of your question with regard to the rise of China and its determination that it wants to be a financial powerhouse. So let's talk about some facts here. So U.S. is the largest single economy in the world with GDP of about $16 trillion. I believe China this year is about 40% of that, around $6 trillion. It just surpassed Japan as the second largest GDP, but it's still less than half of the U.S. China is going to grow faster, in my mind, over the course of the next 10 to 20 years, but China has some problem, its own problem. It's run by Chinese Communist Party, and they don't have a system, in my mind, that is sustainable in the long term. Something has to change here with the way the Chinese leadership actually runs the country. Do you know how many billionaires there are in the U.S. Congress today? 0. There are no billionaires in the Senate or the House of Representatives. This is a leader, and President Obama is not a billionaire either. Do you know how many billionaires there are who are members of the Chinese Communist Party? About 130. Okay? So how is it a communism actually creates more billionaires than the greatest capitalistic country in the history of the world? That is not sustainable. They don't have a rule of law like what we have in the United States. They will never, in my mind, at least in my lifetime, ever create a financial market as deep and broad as the U.S. stock and equity market. And China also has a long-term issue with its one-child policy that they have to resolve here through immigration law changes and the like. And last but not least, the division of wealth in China is far too wide right now between the 130 Chinese Communist Party billionaires and the poorest in China who don't even eat 3 meals a day here. That is not like the United States. So that is a long-winded way of saying that China will continue to grow in power, but I think it will be a very long time, if ever, before China becomes a peer of the United States from a financial markets perspective. Okay? Yes.
Thank you for your wonderful speech. I'm Theo Kim in Korea University Business School, and since we didn't cover much about your personal life here, I just want to ask a little bit of lighter question than the previous person. So I wanted to ask, what was your one thing that you did in the university that was most helpful to become where you are today, to be a CEO in a Wall Street finance institution? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Theo. Well, you're a good-looking guy, so since you're a Kim, maybe we could be related. Oh, well, elder, away from my studies here, I played a lot of video games when I was in college. So if you play a lot of video games, you're destined to be successful. Yeah, I remember at the University of Michigan Business School in the early 80s, I think that was before any of you were born, we had the old boxes where we used to play video games, and at lunchtime, my friends and I would go to the local pizza place and have a slice of pizza and a Coke, and we played video games here. And so I think that's actually one part of why I was successful. Now, I want to tell you why that is the case. It's not the video game. So I actually grew up in a very Americanized environment. So I was, have you heard the term banana?
Yes.
You're yellow on the outside, white on the inside. I'm very white on the inside here because I grew up with Americans. All my friends in college were Americans, white Americans. And so the video game, I played video games with a Jewish friend from New Jersey and I think a German friend from Ohio, and also a German friend from Chicago, John Stahl, whom my father, who's here, and my daughter knows. And what the importance of that is actually when other Korean Americans in my generation were just associating with Koreans, my friends were Americans. In fact, it was not until recently I actually had more Korean friends. Until recently, meaning like within the past 10 years. So I actually think that for me, interacting with the white population was very helpful, especially for my generation. Now, the benefit that you all have is actually there are a lot of westernized Koreans, and even this university is a great example. You're being taught in English. Your English is excellent. You have Caucasian friends and the like. So it's a different environment, but back in the early 80s, when very few Asians were actually in universities and certainly in business, the fact that I had Caucasian friends was a big advantage for me in my career. Okay?
And for the last question, can I ask which video game you played?
Oh, yes, exactly. And my daughter, who had just graduated from University of Pennsylvania, can be a testament to this, is Pac-Man. Was Pac-Man and Galaga. Have you ever heard? You've heard of Pac-Man, right? Yeah. So, in fact, in my home in Connecticut, in our basement, we have a big machine that you can actually play Pac-Man. But it's about this big, just like this.
Thank you for your lecture. And when we are facing the failure or moment that takes me down, what is your method of keeping in optimism?
This is personal failure, work-related or personal failure.
Whatever.
Failure.
Yeah.
In the United States, actually, people have done a lot of research about corporate CEOs. So basically people at my level, and guess what has been a very common experience of people who rise all the way to the top. They actually made one or two really big mistakes in their career. Okay? So even to my point of thoughtful risk-taking, when you're taking risks, sometimes you're going to be wrong. And so you should almost take failure as a positive to say, hey, I made a mistake. I think I'm on the track to becoming a CEO of a company. So I think that's really the attitude here. Now, you cannot make a lot of mistakes. I said one or two, right? So that's how I would view failure or mistakes is that you should not get too hard on yourself and think that you're never going to recover. In fact, you should think of it as a learning, and that's the other important. With mistakes and failures, you need to learn from that so you can make yourself better. And I think that's the inherent cause of optimism. I'll give you another statement or an example. I don't know how many people will go into sales, selling. That's a very good profession. But some of the best salespeople like it when they get rejections. You know why? they say, like if you're selling a mutual fund investment product or even Samsung smartphone, you know that for every 10 times you ask somebody, you only get 1 time where you're going to be successful, right? So the attitude of really good salespeople is that they're looking for 9 rejections, because if they get rejected 9 times, they know the 10th time someone's going to buy here. That's almost the attitude that you have to have as a good salesperson, is that they almost accept failure as almost a constitutional aspect of the way they do their business. Okay? There's a question.
Thank you for your speech, sir. I'm a senior student in Korea University, and I actually have two questions to ask. My first question is that regarding the QE on one of your slides, everybody's kind of expecting that this is going to happen. The tapering is going to happen in September.
Yes.
And that's why the hot money is being pulled out of the Asian markets right now.
Yes.
But you said that it is going to recover in the long term. So when the tapering actually happens, if it is to happen in September, how long do you think it will be, the hot money will be pouring out of the Asian market? Because that's the time that you will actually be investing in those markets if in the long term they're going to rebound. And that was my first question.
I think it's going to happen soon, maybe in the next 6 months. So there's going to be a lot of volatility, and you're absolutely right, and that's a great question, is that the Federal Reserve has now created a $3.6 trillion balance sheet, and they're going to start reducing their monthly bond purchases from $85 billion down to something lower. And our best guess is that it's going to start this month after the federal FOMC meeting on September 19th, 18th and 19th, I believe. And that's going to cause volatility, and that might cause the emerging markets to decline a little bit further. But I would say in the next 3 to 6 months, it's probably a good opportunity to begin thinking about investing in the emerging market, because I think it's going to be short-lived.
Could you tell us a bit about your investment philosophy itself when you're investing in assets?
Oh, there's so many things I could talk about, but let me just pick up on a few here, okay? And I might even give you some quotes of some even more famous, better investor than I, to illustrate the point here is, I think being a contrarian is very important, okay? So the great Warren Buffett, who was one of the world's greatest investors, often said, be fearful when people are greedy, and be greedy when people are fearful. So even your first question, people are very fearful of the emerging markets right now, right? Well, Mr. Buffett would say, be greedy, meaning invest in those markets here. That's an inherent sort of value of being a contrarian, because investors are people. People like to be in the herd mentality, be in the majority. And so oftentimes being in the minority as an investor is actually a good thing, okay? 2 is the great Peter Lynch, who created one of the greatest mutual funds at Fidelity, he's long retired now, used to say, when he especially picked investments, that if he didn't understand the company, he wouldn't buy it. So you have to have a basic understanding of a company before you should invest in that. If you don't understand it, and Warren Buffett said the same thing, you shouldn't buy that company, okay? So that's another. The third is the long-term investing is really what matters, right? So do not be a quick investor. Now, you know, I've got a coworker here, Mr. Jay Yoon. Jay, you want to stand up for a second? He's one of my best investment professionals, okay? So he's with me. And Mr. Yoon and I talk about this often here. Actually, Koreans by nature are not good investors, okay? Because Koreans are too short-term oriented, right? What is it called? Bali, 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 right? And they want to make quick profit. That's not a good idea, okay? So what I would say is, if you have that tendency, take the opposite approach. Instead of looking for quick ideas, look for long-term ideas. Instead of big profits, look for small profits. And that will serve your needs very, very well. So those are 3 things amongst many that I would advise to you. Okay?
Yeah, thank you for your awesome speech. And my name is Son Yoon-jun, and my major is chemical engineering. And in the doctor's course, I plan to study new renewable energy such as solar energy and hydrogen energy. You said shale tech is promising and energy costs will be lower, right? And in this situation, I'm wondering what you think about investing in green energy technology.
Investing in green technology?
Yes.
Yes. So, yes, I believe now, my comments about shale technology was related specifically to the United States. But if you look at global sources of fuel, the fossil fuel is going to be depleting every year, and so it's a certainty in my mind that green technology will become more and more important over the coming decades. And so I think that even the profession that you aspire to will be a very good profession. In fact, I think one of the benefits of renewable technology, energy, and green technology is that the advances in core technology is actually so dramatic right now, right? The 5 years that I mentioned to you, that solar technology and others like that we have used in the past here is going to be even better in the coming decades. So just because shale revolution is going to benefit the U.S. does not mean that green technology is going to decline. I think they're both going to do well for the long term, okay? So with that, thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you perhaps in the next year or so. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.